How does your work define you? And as you start to walk through the working world, you'll start to notice that you'll be given labels, given titles, given roles, and these have an expectation as to how to act, how to be, how to express, how to behave in the world. And maybe you're someone that doesn't like this. Maybe every time someone tries to label you, you shun it away and you're like, don't like that. Do not give me a label. I'm more than that. Or maybe you're someone that enjoys the label and you recognize that it's just an aspect of who you are, but it can't contain the totality of who you are. And whether you are somebody that likes labels, that doesn't like labels, that is like, yeah, they're all right, but they don't, give me everything. I wanted to go into depth in this video as to how the work that you do defines you and why labels and titles are such a big part of that. And if you don't know who I am, my name is Joel Yuli, and I'm a philosopher, and I help people from all around the world, people from Brazil, Argentina, all around Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the US, to know with conviction their career archetype and choose their career path. And I work with different people and help them to understand this career archetype, which is often best understood as a title, as a label. Now, this is just the beginning of what a career archetype is, because really what it is it's this energetic expression that's at the base level of your soul, and it's this foundation point on which you can start to build a meaningful and purposeful vocation out in the world. But people often recognize it through titles like designer, poet, philosopher, artist, filmmaker, perfumer, cabinet maker. You have all these different titles that give an understanding or an introduction, at least, to the energetic expression or this area of vocation that's connected to an individual. And so when we start to understand what our own personal title is, we can walk a better and more aligned life according to the calling that we're meant to be pursuing in this lifetime that is connected to our soul. Now, the interesting thing is that most people are not connected to their soul, they're not connected to their true calling, they're not connected to their vocation. Instead, what they're connected to is, how do I keep the bills paid? How do I make sure I keep the lights on? How do I make sure I feed my family? When all those survival needs are met, then it starts to move into things like, how can I afford the holiday? How can I get a second car? How can I make sure that we go somewhere nice on the weekend with the family? As opposed to really getting in connection with the work that they're born to do. And these titles can give us, like I said, this connection point into our soul. But when you're not connected to it, you end up going and steering off course. You go towards things that aren't naturally connected to what it is that you're meant to be doing. And it was interesting, the other weekend, I was walking around with my partner, and we're walking past this restaurant. And on the floor of this restaurant, it sort of had this, there's this sort of, it was like a replica of the Californian walkway where they've got all the different stars and the names of those stars. And because it was in Australia, it had the Australian names and their titles. And so we started walking past people, walked past Tim Winton, author, Adam Gilchrist, cricketer, Ian Thorpe, swimmer. And you go through these different titles like a politician or an artist or an activist or a humanitarian, poet, and just start to notice that these different names were connected with these different titles. And as I was walking through this and walking over these different names, I started to think to myself, I wonder if this is how they wanted to be defined. I wonder if this is how they wanted to be, identified with the world, because maybe they did and maybe they didn't. There's a few people in this world, and this is kind of like a fateful few who naturally start to walk in life and get to start to walk the path they feel called for. They find it very early on and they get connected to it and they don't let it go, and this is the path that they go down. Now, these people that seem to be able to forge their own way and make the world sort of bend to them so that they can walk their path, this isn't the ordinary thing that happens. The most common thing that actually happens is people get or receive these different identities based on the work that they are expressing because they're trying to achieve different aims. And because they're trying to achieve these different aims, they start to get identified with labels that they don't really connect with, or they don't really see themselves as, and yet they're being connected to this particular title. And so you start to think about these different paths and these different titles and their connection points, And you can start to ponder on your own personal life and look at the different titles that are going on within your life. Maybe you are a customer service rep. Maybe you are a marketing officer. Maybe you are a nurse. And these titles might be very connected to what it is that you want to be doing, but they might not be. And the thing is that when they're not, oftentimes we will, disassociate with them and say, it's not that big a deal. I'm doing this path, I'm walking this way, I'm taking on this title because I need to, make sure that I get food on the table. And that's totally understandable. The problem though with that is that these titles, they hold a weight and they hold a power that can begin to devour who it is that you are. And the way that they do this is that the title ends up having a set of traits and characteristics and behaviors and beliefs. And because it has these different sort of set of these bundles of energy, they can begin to take over how you would naturally act, how you would naturally speak and express, and they tell you how to do it instead. So if you were to imagine someone that is, a middle manager, maybe they are not normally somebody that likes to, tell everyone what to do. Maybe they are not somebody that likes to have meetings with a group and say, hey, you need to make sure you do this week, you need to make sure that you do this, and here's where we're at, and here's our KPIs, and blah, blah, blah. But yet, if they get that label, they will start to act like that because the title demands it, the role demands it. And they can go home afterwards and say, I'm not really that person. I'm actually more of a creative person. I'm actually more, pursuing these spiritual pursuits on the side, and that's who I really am. But the thing is that because they're behaving like that most of the time, it starts to solidify who they are. It starts to solidify their personality and who they are becoming, which can be a real problem. And the way that I sort of think about this, and an analogy to think about, is if you would ever have broken a bone in your body. Let's say you had a broken arm, and you were to go to the hospital, and you were to, we're waiting in the ER room, and you finally get some time, and they find out it's a broken arm, you've had the x-ray, then you would start to get a cast on it, and they would start to put the plaster over that cast. Now, in the beginning, the plaster is very soft, it's very malleable, it can move, you can still move your arm around, even if it's broken, you can still fiddle it around a little bit. But over time, once that cast begins to set in, right, it starts to harden, it starts to solidify, you can no longer move your arm, and it starts to put that arm into its proper place. And this is what titles and roles can do. They start to set people into a particular kind of way where that rigidity causes them to behave, act, believe, and think in certain styles or modes of thought. And this can be really, really dangerous, especially when the path that you're meant to be walking isn't, connected to the roles or the titles that you've taken on, because you start to behave and act in one way, and that your calling needs you to be another way. And the longer that you wait to actually pursue the calling, the more solidified the plaster becomes, the cast becomes, and it gets a lot harder to actually transition out of a path. And it's not impossible. You can always transition out of a path. You can always, break out. But the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes. And this sort of first came up into my own personal attention when I was working as a claims assessor. So that's the title, claims assessor. And the role was essentially to, go through these damage and loss claims and to say whether a package, if it had gone lost, and did it deserve a payout to the person who sent it? If it got damaged, did it deserve a payout? Was it covered by the terms? All very interesting stuff. And as I was working this role, we ended up getting an email from my boss. And the boss essentially said, hey, I want us to be more active on social media. We really want to push out this company onto social media, particularly onto LinkedIn. And we're going to get everybody a photograph for their profile. And so he brought in a photographer, and the photographer, came in and took everyone's headshots. And I still remember I had to go outside against this brick wall, and the sun was in my face, and it was at the wrong time anyway. So, golden hour had well passed. And so the sun was overhead, and I'm looking at this camera and, takes the photo, and I forget about it. And a couple of weeks later, they ended up bringing the photos to us. And, I saw my photo, and I was there, in this sort of blue shirt. And I remember looking at this photo and being like, that is not me. That cannot be me. And at the same time, as it's going on, I'm starting to realize like, oh, that is me, and that's the person that I'm becoming. I'm becoming the claims assessor. I'm becoming this person that is playing this role. And it started to sort of come into my awareness that I was, solidifying a person that was not the person that I wanted to be. I was walking on a path that I shouldn't be walking on. And this happens with a lot of people, that they're not aware that these different titles are solidifying who they are. They think that they are the person that, is free on the Saturday and goes and ventures to, the bookstore, or goes and, writes some pieces at night, or they go and, work on some video editing before work and whatnot. But the longer that you stay in those jobs and those roles that aren't for you, the more they solidify in. So they have to pull back. One of the things that I tell students when they start working with me and unearthing the career archetype is one of the very first things to do is you start to pull back the energy that you're pouring into the current work that you're doing. It doesn't mean that you quit. It doesn't mean that you leave immediately, but instead you start to pull back and say like, hey, I can't keep pouring so much effort and so much energy and so much feeling into this current work because it's taking me with it. It's making me become somebody that I'm not meant to become. And I still remember, posting that photo on LinkedIn and then just, reading the description and reading the labels and seeing that if somebody else was to see this, if somebody else was to look onto this page, they'd be like, oh yeah, this person, they fit the description of a claims assessor, they fit the title, they fit what this title is meant to represent. And so often people will end up falling into the vacuum that is the titles that they get because they need to pay the bills, because they need to make sure that the water is running. And they aren't aware of the later repercussions and the consequences of simply showing up and being immersed in a role that isn't actually the role that they're meant to be pursuing. You start to evolve over time in these different roles as well. And so your own personality and your own identity starts to match closer and closer with the role that you've been given. And the longer you stay in it, the longer you move towards it. And so you want to gain some awareness. You want to gain some awareness internally, because there's always this internal element where you start to look into yourself and say, is this actually the role for me? If you are already aware that this isn't for you, then you want to start pulling the energy back from it, pulling the extra hours, the extra effort, the extra attention that you're giving to it, and start to put it in a direction that you're actually meant for, a direction. Maybe you don't even know what it is in a definite way, but you know that, hey, maybe it's more in the creative space. Hey, maybe it's more in the spiritual space. Hey, maybe it's more in the alternative healing space. And you start to pour energy into that direction as opposed to doing extra for something that you don't want to be in on the long term. And you also want to start to make note of the external facets. So you want to, one great one that would have worked for me is if I had have looked at myself in the mirror and just looked at myself, in the outfits that I was wearing and the ways in which I was behaving, or even if I was to take a call and see myself and start to observe myself, which is why meditation is so great, because you can pull yourself out of your own sense of self and start to observe what you're doing. And you can start to ask, like, is this really how I want to behave? Is this really how I want to act? And you want to get some clarity as to what it is that you look like, both externally and internally. So the thought that entered my mind as I was walking over these different tiles was, if I just saw these names and there was no titles associated with it, and the people whose names I was reading were there with me, I wondered, would they actually want those particular definitions, those titles next to their names? Would they want that, on the floor, in hard, rock solid cement? Or would they have wanted to change it? And I think that if you start to think through your own titles, your own sort of things that you're being defined as, and you ask yourself that same question, it will give you an understanding as to whether or not you need to, make a change, or whether or not this is actually for you. And if you're interested in unearthing your own career archetype and you want to go through this process of knowing which career path to choose with conviction, you want to go through this awareness process. We burn away temptation paths, we go over your personality, we go over your different psychological barriers in order to really get to the heart and the soul of what it is that you're meant to be doing with this life, what it is that your calling is, what it is that your vocation is. Then I'll leave a link underneath this video.